Linda Bergstrom married a Navy man who promised to keep her safe forever.
We were in love with each other. You can feel it.
James is very protective of her. He really cared what she thought.
But Linda would soon discover the hideous truth about her husband's disturbing double life.
During the day, all he ever thought about was attacking women. And at night, that's all he dreamed about.
Tied her hands behind her back and told her I would never hurt her.
What do you do when the man you once loved turns out to be a monster?
I didn't know when he would snap.
And only you can put him behind bars for good.
He did way too much. He needed to be caught.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Linda Bergstrom grew up in a Texas family where children were seen, but not heard.
We were Catholics. There's 2 brothers and 2 sisters. My father, he was rather strict with us. We weren't allowed to have friends. We weren't allowed to walk around the house freely. We were really confined to certain areas.
But after graduating from high school, Linda began to spread her wings. She soon started dating a young man named James Bergstrom.
We met in February of '84. And after a while with us talking and dating, he said, well, will you be my girlfriend? And I said, yes.
20-year-old James worked at the local paint factory. He was quiet and sensitive, and his chivalrous nature won Linda over.
He was very protective of her. He was very solicitous of her. He opened doors. His manners were great. He acted as if he really cared what she thought.
Then, one morning after over a year together, Linda got a phone call that quickly took their relationship to the next level.
James had called me up and he said that he made a decision to join the Navy with his brother. And then he said, but before I go, we're gonna get married.
The proposal came as quite a surprise, but Linda knew she wanted to be with James no matter what.
The day that we got married was on April the 25th, 1985. That morning, he called me up and he says, get ready, we're gonna go get married. And I'm like, what, you know? He says, just get dressed, we're gonna go do it.
After their speedy courthouse wedding, the newlyweds moved to Bangor, Washington, so James could begin his new career in the Navy.
We drove to Washington State, and it was a beautiful view. Everything was new. Everything was exciting.
Enchanted by her new surroundings, Linda quickly settled into her new life in the Great Northwest. James, however, didn't seem to make the transition quite as well.
James started to have this temper. He didn't like being in the military. He hated it. I mean, that's all he talked about was getting out of the service.
James had given the Navy a 4-year commitment, but just months into his service, he became determined to find a way out.
All he talked about is going back home, going back to where his friends were at so he can go out and play basketball. That's all he talked about, those 2 things.
James desperately wanted to move back to Houston, where he promised things would return to normal. But life with James would never be normal again. It all came to a head almost 4 years later, on May 18th, 1989. Linda came home from work to find 2 men in suits waiting for her, and they had shocking news.
One of the men confronted me with his badge, and he says he was a detective, and he told me that James was arrested. He says, your husband was caught watching a 53-year-old woman undress. I was like, whoa, no. You've got to be kidding me.
But a peeping Tom was nothing compared to what James would ultimately prove to be.
I was terrified. At that point, I probably went into shock.
In the fall of 1985, 4 years before James was arrested for peeping on a female neighbor, Linda's new husband was having trouble adjusting to Navy life in Washington State.
James hated being in the Navy, and he despised being out on the submarine. And from his first voyage to his second, it just got worse.
It was sort of like a cycle. We would get into arguments before he went to sea. When he came back from sea, we would get into arguments again.
As the months passed, the pattern continued. But soon, James appeared to have finally found a healthy way to deal with the stress.
In order to relieve the stress and the anger, James started to take jogs at night, and they got longer and more frequent. Linda didn't mind him taking the jogs. She thought it was a great idea.
And for a while, the nighttime jogging seemed to work.
I noticed that he would kind of mellow out. So everything seemed like it was going okay.
And that life continued without interruption until one night when Linda saw something she was never supposed to see. It was October of 1988. Linda and James were unloading groceries when James suddenly disappeared.
I went upstairs and I turned back and I said, well, where's James? You know, I thought he was helping me with the groceries. So I went downstairs and I kind of looked towards the right and I saw him between the fence and a window. And I looked at him, I says, well, what are you doing? And he saw me and then he picks up a screen and he says, oh, there's this screen, you know, we need a screen for our window.
Linda wasn't sure what she had just witnessed, but she couldn't shake an unmistakable feeling of dread.
I says, no, you were looking in the window, weren't you? He says, no. He says, I wasn't doing that. I questioned that, and he looked rather sincere, you know. He said, I didn't do anything.
Linda was hopeful that the incident was just a misunderstanding. And before long, life returned to normal.
Everything sort of mellowed out, you know. That's when we'd go out places and do things together, and he seemed to be fine.
And life was fine until the spring of 1989, when Protective James began to worry about his young wife's safety.
There was a rapist who had been terrorizing an area called Parkwood for quite some time. He'd been breaking into houses, and James was terrified that this man had shown up at their door.
Parkwood wasn't far from their new home outside of Bangor, Washington, and the media had seized upon the story of the Parkwood rapist.
James told me, you know, there's somebody wearing a ski mask. Lock the doors, you know, make sure the windows are locked.
Linda took appropriate precautions and never thought much about the rapist until just a few weeks later on May 18th, 1989. That was the day when Linda learned that James had been arrested for peeping.
I came into the apartment. There were detectives in the house. They had told me that he was arrested for peeping through a window.
Was James a peeping Tom? The thought was bad enough, but nothing could have prepared Linda for what investigators told her next.
The detective said, we think he is the Parkwood rapist. And I says, look, okay, peeping Tom, maybe, but a rapist, no way. So I said, you know what, I don't understand this. I think at that point, I probably went into shock.
Fearing the worst, Linda went down to the station, where James had already confessed to the peeping incident.
I asked him, I said, did you commit this rape? He says, no. He says, I didn't do any of that.
After several hours in custody and heavy questioning, James was finally released.
The police in the Seattle area really couldn't get enough evidence together to charge James, and the Navy was embarrassed by the situation and just wanted James to leave. So they offered to pay his way back to Houston.
At long last, James was free from the Navy and Linda was hopeful that moving back to Houston might save their struggling marriage. But things were about to go from bad to even worse.
I wasn't sure who he was at this point. That was like living in hell.
By the fall of 1991, 6 years into their marriage, James and Linda Bergstrom were back in Houston and caring for their 18-month-old daughter. But instead of getting better as he'd promised, life with James had become unbearable.
Linda really tried hard to keep it together, but James's anger escalated. He would become angry over the smallest thing. He didn't like what she was wearing. He didn't like the way she looked at somebody else. He didn't like something she said to someone.
I wasn't sure who he was. I looked at him as if he was a stranger at this point.
By now, Linda had grown suspicious of James's late-night jogs.
Linda didn't mind James taking the jog, but then she began to see some things that troubled her. James had come home and he'd have grass stains in the torn pants. One day she saw him looking through a window at their apartment complex where she knew that there was a woman at home.
James's behavior became increasingly bizarre, and as the fighting grew worse, James became violent.
James was a typical abusive husband in some ways. He would be physically violent with her and then afterward apologize and say that he loved her.
He threatened to kill me many times. I had bruises. I had a black eye. I was terrified.
Meanwhile, Linda wasn't the only woman in the Houston area living in fear. Detectives from the Houston Police Department were already in hot pursuit of another dangerous man, a rapist preying on women in the greater Houston area.
My apartment manager called me one night and advised me that the individual had come into one of the apartment complexes and had attacked a couple of females. When I went over to the apartment and I spoke with the two young ladies, they said he had a gun and he had a very unusual ski mask that he was wearing.
People in Houston were amazed that this was going on right here in the city. It was big news, made big headlines here.
As the list of victims grew to over 20, Linda began to think that the police in Washington state had been right about James all along.
I would always ask him, I says, did you commit that rape? You know, what happened? And he would say, no, I didn't do that. He says, all I did was look through a window and there's nothing wrong, you know, one honest mistake, you know. He says, you're making a big deal out of this.
As she grew more and more certain that her husband was a rapist, Linda knew she was trapped.
Linda couldn't leave him because if she left him and got a divorce, he told her he would fight for custody of their daughter. And she knew that that meant that the daughter could be victimized.
So instead of leaving her abusive husband, Linda did something most unexpected. She turned from a loving wife to a vigilante, determined to help put James in jail.
I thought, you know what? That's it. I'm gonna see to it that this is gonna stop.
She monitored how much gas he had in the car. She monitored when he left for work, kept a record of when he got back. If he was going out with a friend to play basketball, she called the friend, made sure that's where he was really going.
It was important to stay because he needed to be caught. He needed to be put away.
Then on the night of December 6th, 1991, Linda finally got the break she needed when the phone rang in the middle of the night.
James called me up, told me, hey, you know, I was arrested. He was out late at night and he got pulled over. He says, I didn't have my license. He says, you're gonna come out here and pay my bond and I'll be out.
Early the next morning, after James was released, Linda went to retrieve his car from the impound lot.
I climbed into the car and I couldn't believe what I saw. I was terrified. I immediately saw duct tape, ski mask, and I believe he had some rope there too. And I knew these were his toys.
And Linda knew that she had to call the police immediately.
I started passing red lights, stop signs. I didn't care. At this point, I just wanted to get home and call the police department.
Linda filed a report that soon came to the attention of Lieutenant Charles Dunn.
I pulled up that offense report, and Linda Bergstrom had reached out to the Houston Police Department Sex Crimes Division and reported to them that she thought that her husband may be attacking women. And the thing that I keyed on was a ski mask.
And as he dug further, Lieutenant Dunn knew he was scratching the surface of a case utterly unlike anything he'd ever seen before.
We needed to stop James before he did become the most prolific serial rapist in the nation.
I didn't know when he would snap. A person like him, you just don't know.
By December of 1991, Linda Bergstrom's worst fears had been realized. It appeared that her husband James was a serial rapist. But there wasn't enough evidence for the Houston police to make an arrest just yet.
Well, they didn't have any DNA or anything that tied James to these attacks, and so they really needed an eyewitness. They needed someone who could identify him.
The wait was excruciating. For 3 months, Linda lived a nightmare, fearing for her life.
That was like living in hell.
Then, on December 27th, 1992, detectives finally got a huge break in the case.
It began that day when I came into work. Crime analysis was waiting for me. They had the case of the 17-year-old girl, and she actually saw his face.
A 17-year-old girl had heroically fought off the rapist, and her positive ID finally broke the case wide open.
She gave a great description of what happened, what occurred. It was really all we needed to make the case.
James Bergstrom was arrested in the parking lot of his apartment complex that afternoon.
I spotted this vehicle first with the license plate. I immediately went up, removed him from the car, and handcuffed him.
Linda learned of James's arrest later that day.
And the phone rang and it was him. And he said, "I'm in jail. They caught me." And he says, I'm tired of this. He says, "I'm gonna get help." And I says, "Good. Finally, you need to tell them everything."
That night, James confessed to attacking over a dozen women.
How did you get in the house?
Through the garage door. Tied her hands behind her back and took off her clothes. And I touched her and caressed her and told her I would never hurt her. Then I left.
The one thing that he told me that will live with me forever is he said that during the day, all he ever thought about was attacking women. And at night, that's all he dreamed about.
The details of James's crimes spelled out a disturbing story.
James was really not out jogging in order to get physically fit. He was out there stalking women. He was jogging through neighborhoods, looking for open garage doors, looking for women who were home alone, watching to see what was happening in the neighborhoods.
You have to understand, rape and sexual assault are two of the most underreported crimes there are. So, you know, there could be 50, 60, there could be hundreds. And unfortunately, I don't even think James knows.
It was one of the biggest cases of serial rape and sexual assault the Houston PD had ever seen. And everyone agreed that Linda deserved enormous credit for putting James behind bars.
If she had maintained her silence, if she hadn't come forward, I don't know how long it would have been before he was caught and stopped.
Because she elected to stay and because she elected to reach out to law enforcement, we were able to stop James before he did become the most prolific serial rapist in the nation.
James Bergstrom was indicted on 13 counts of aggravated sexual assault and robbery. After pleading guilty to multiple charges, he was sentenced on September 30th, 1992.
I saw the victims as they entered the courtroom, and I felt bad for every one of them. They gave him 4 99-year sentences, and I was very glad to hear that.
Today, Linda lives a quiet life with her daughter and new husband in suburban Houston. And she's removed everything that reminds her of the man who made her life a nightmare.
I got rid of everything. I got rid of every picture we owned, every spoon, every piece of furniture. I wanted nothing to be reminded of this person. It took me a long time to trust anybody. Probably wouldn't trust the person next door.
But after so many years, life is looking up for Linda.
Today I feel very comfortable. I'm very happy. Before my life was in hell, and today I can say I'm in heaven.